Okay, today we're going to talk about the number one mistake that Ableton producers make when it comes to mixing down their tracks. If you're using the Ableton stock EQ, EQ8, and your kicks and basses sound kind of lumpy and plasticky and you don't really know why, then you're probably doing this exact thing. And what's more, it's not really your fault because Ableton isn't actually showing you the whole story of what's going on in your mix. I work as a production tutor and as a mixing and mastering engineer, and in both of those roles I've come across this exact problem, and when I've spoken to people about it, I've been able to say, hey, are you doing this thing? And they've said, yes, I'm doing that thing. It is the number one pet peeve of mine when I'm handed stuff to work on. And it's the easiest fix that most of my tuition clients actually apply to their stuff that gives them the best results quickest. So let's get stuck in and I'll explain exactly what I mean. Okay, so here I am in Ableton, and this is actually the session, this is a client session that I was working with that actually made me want to make this video in the first place. So yes, I was working with someone, they wanted to brush up on their mix downs and scale up and improve the quality of the results that they were getting. So I'll just play you a bit of the track so you can hear what it sounds like, and we'll talk about it, and we'll talk about the actual issue that we're coming across here. So it's a cool track, got some cool bass sound design. Some nice grooves along the way. I think the composition of it is really strong. Nice escalation of what's going on. But this track, I would say, is kind of emblematic of exactly the problem that I'm talking about today, and it's a problem with EQ8. So let's talk about that. Now, right here, right away, we've got an example of this issue. So let's listen to this kick drum here. Now, there's other things going on with this kick drum that I would adjust, that wouldn't be the way that I personally would mix this track. But we're not going to focus on those just now. We're just going to focus on this one thing, which is this bad boy over here, the high pass filter, and specifically the times for really steep high pass filter that you can put on your elements of your track when you're in Ableton. I spoke to this client about this, and what he said was that it looks like, he chooses this because it looks like it's really surgical, like it's really just precise, and it's just gonna take out all the stuff that you don't want below that certain point and leave the stuff that you do want, which is kind of true, but also kind of not true. And I think the main issue with what we've got here is that, let's expand this out, is that we are working mainly with what we can see rather than what we can hear. Because when we look at this, this slope, this really steep roll off that we've got here, looks like it's, much more precise and much more kind of neutral than the kind of default high pass. But that's not the only element of the story. I think you'll particularly hear it if I ramp up where we place this high pass. Because if you listen, let's just listen to the difference between this default high pass with the default slope at 166 Hertz versus the really steep one. Now, yes, we're getting rid of a lot more low end, but actually what's happening is we're getting like a weird bump right around this cutoff frequency. And actually, I think before bouncing this out, this sounds like it's had one of these high pass filters already applied to it before it was bounced out as an audio file. So let's take a listen to some of the bass sounds, and that might help us to clear up what we're hearing here. Okay, so we've got the bass tracks, right? And these are split into bass and sub bass. We've got the sub bass here, and and then the bass is kind of like all the stuff that's above a sort of 80 hertz or so. But this sound in particular is a perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about. So this kind of respace thing here, if we explode this out so that we can see exactly what we've got going on, just listen to the difference. All I'm going to do is change the slope. Can you hear that pitch? It starts to jump out. Especially if I move this up. So, you know, and especially if I move this up to some of these higher frequencies, even just like the kind of relative balance of the different harmonics that we've got going on is changing quite dramatically when we use this ×4 filter versus the standard slope. Now we're going to do an A-B comparison just of this one section of the track, and I'm going to show you the original version with all of these ×4 high-pass filters, and then all I'm going to do is swap all of those to the gentler slope, and we'll do a direct A-B comparison so you can hear exactly what this is doing to the mix. Okay, so what is actually going on here? What is the difference between the really steep slope and the normal slope, and like why does it sound so different when all we're doing is like taking away frequencies below that cutoff point? To show you what's happening here, I'm going to use a program called Plugin Doctor, which gives us all kinds of different analysis tools for seeing what a plugin does. And sadly, we can't load the Ableton stock EQ into Plugin Doctor to analyze what's actually happening underneath the hood, but it's exactly the same as any other EQ. So I'm going to use FabFilter Pro Q3 because it gives us lots of options for explaining what's actually going on here. All we're going to do, first of all, is create a high pass filter, and there we are. You can see on the frequency plot, the change that's happening in the sound is perfectly mirrored between Plugin Doctor and what we're doing in Pro Q3. So by default, we're getting a high pass filter of 12 decibels per octave, meaning for every octave, for every time we halve the frequency going down the frequency graph, we are reducing the relative level by 12 dB. So if we've got our frequency set at 150 hertz, then at 75 hertz, the volume level is reduced by 12 dB, and so on and so forth. So if we multiply that slope by 4, we get 48 decibels per octave. So that sounds like this. So we're getting that same thing happening as we were with EQ8. There's a couple of things happening here that explain this difference. The first is that anytime you take away frequencies using an EQ, if you compensate the level after the fact to kind of match in terms of loudness, then what you've essentially done is you've raised the level of all the stuff that you didn't cut, if that makes sense. So if I take out the low end, then we're raising the level of all the stuff, all the mid-range, all the high end. The other thing that's happening is slightly more complex, and it's happening because of the interaction between lots of these different really steep high pass filters all across the mix, all across your low end in particular, that's kind of fudging things and moving things around and making things weird and resonant in unhelpful ways. So to explain this, we're going to go back to the plugin doctor. And instead of looking at the frequency response of the plugin, we're going to look at the phase response. Now, changing the phase of a frequency, using phase to cancel out different portions of the signal. That's how EQ works. Watch Dan Worrell's video for a fantastic explainer of why EQ doesn't actually cause phase shift is the cause of EQ. That's a really great video. I'll link it down in the description and also up there right now. But when we are using high pass filters, you can see here, we are shifting the relative phase of the frequencies below the cutoff versus above the cutoff, and that doesn't happen in a neat kind of like straightforward way. This 12 decibel per octave high pass, you know, we're kind of fairly smoothly changing, and that's totally fine and totally acceptable. But by the time we get to this 48 dB per octave high pass filter, our phase plot looks like this. So we're getting this very radical change of the relative phase of different frequencies in our bass signal to one another. And you can see here, you know, if I set this to, let's just put it to 100 hertz. What happens is, you know, you can see here down kind of plus and minus about 60 hertz from our cutoff frequency. We're rotating the full way through the phase of our frequencies, the phase of our signal. And what happens is when you layer, you know, if you think about layering multiple of these 48 dB per octave filters throughout your kick and your bass and, you know, any other layers that you've got, snare drums, all of this stuff, what happens is you are rotating the phase of your different elements of your mix by different amounts at different frequencies across your whole kind of low end of your mix, everything below kind of like 200 hertz-ish. You're rotating the phase of all of those things so that they don't kind of retain their punch, and you get these weird kind of resonance bumps and fighting of the different frequencies, and ends up making your track sound plasticky, sound lumpy, sound weird, in a way that could be pretty much avoided if you were to just use the gentler slope on your high pass. Well, we learned a couple of things. First is that the high pass filter, when we use it in 48 dB per octave mode, it introduces this big resonance bump right around the cutoff frequency that just kind of sounds a bit unnatural. And like for the purposes of like rolling off that low end in a kind of like natural sounding way, in a kind of smooth way, you know, a lot of that really deep sub we can get rid of quite handily just by using the 12 dB per octave version of the filter. What else have we learned? Well, we've learned that actually Ableton's stock EQ, EQ8, doesn't give us the full picture. It's only showing us on the visual display, it's only showing us the frequency response of what we are doing to the sound. And it's not showing us the phase response of what we're doing to the sound. And that introduces a lot of difficulties when we've got multiple EQs stacking up all across the mix, changing the phase of different frequencies relative to one another and interacting and infighting in a weird way. And what can we actually do about it? Well, there's a few things that we can do about it. The first thing that we can do is to A/B test the ×4 slope and the default slope, just to listen and hear which one we prefer, not only with the track soloed, but also in the context of the entire mix. The second thing that we can do is to actually turn off the frequency graph inside of EQ8, because it's not going to give us the full story. The number one thing that you need to learn to do is to trust your ears when you're mixing. Especially when you're starting out, it can be a really tough thing to do because you only know that you don't know very much. And, you know, all of these visual aids that we have, all of the information that the computer gives us is really great. It's really helpful, but it shouldn't be the number one thing that you're using to decide how your track is going to sound and what changes and what moves you're making in terms of your mix. The best way to train your ears, to train your hearing, is to turn off those additional visual stimuli and just listen using your ears to what's happening in the mix. So let's do that. I've turned off, we've got this control just here. You can see that when I flick it off, we get rid of the frequency display, the amplitude of the different frequencies on EQ8, and all we're left with is our hearing to make the decisions with. And just listening and just using our hearing in the context of the mix. Which sounds fuller, which sounds more natural, which has the harmonic content that we actually want. And how are these things stacking up and piling up against one another? So what have we learned? Well, hopefully we've learned that we can't always trust our eyes when it comes to making decisions about making music, because ultimately making music is about what we hear with our ears. We've learned that a steeper high-pass filter produces additional resonances and phase shifts that may cause problems with our mixes if we're not being conscious and intentional about how we use them. And we've also learned that in order to start trusting our hearing, which is the number one skill that you need to develop, you trust your hearing, you trust your judgment, you trust your taste when it comes to writing tracks and like picking sounds and thinking, does this melody work? Does this bass line work? Do I like this drum pattern? You can trust yourself when you do that. If you can't trust yourself when it comes to producing and mixing down your track, if you can't trust what you're hearing to say, hey, this is what I like and this is how it needs to sound and I feel good about this decision, the best way that you can learn to trust your ears over what you're seeing is to turn off those visual elements and train your ears. Just get used to learning to trust what you hear. I hope you've enjoyed this video. My name's Joni, I run Outsider Sound and I help music producers like yourself by providing tuition, creative coaching, mixing and mastering services. Whatever you need, I would love to work with you. If you want to find out more about working with me, head to the description to find out all you could possibly need to know. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.